Colossians says something was nailed to the cross, but it wasn't the 10 Commandments. Let's see what the Bible really says. Let's read what Colossians 2 verse 14 says to us. It indicates blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us and took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. I think that's pretty clear. Now, because this is in the New Testament, we are going to look at the Greek. And the Greek word cheirographon indicates a handwritten record of debt, sort of like an IOU. And in the Greek, when we see the word dogma, it's indicating decrees or ceremonial regulations. Ceremonial. So what's the point? Well, Paul is talking about the record of ceremonial laws. That's what he's referring to here. Things like sacrifices, feast days, purification rites. In other words, things which pointed to Christ. And what this keeps telling us is that the ceremonial laws were a shadow. Now, if we look in Ephesians 2 verse 15, it says they were abolished. The law of commandments contained in what? In ordinances. Which ordinances? The handwritten ordinances. We're not talking about the moral law. This is why Colossians 2 verse 16 and 17, which is quoted many times, talks about these being shadows, and the body is of Christ. The substance is of Christ. Hebrews 9 verse 9 and 10 also says to us, these rituals were imposed until the time of Reformation. In other words, the time of the cross. Again, the point here is that the shadow ended when the reality, which is Jesus Christ, came. We've even got support in the Old Testament for this if we look at the book of Deuteronomy chapter 31, and we're going to read verse 24 to 26. Now what we see here is that Moses writes this law, his law, right? He handwrites this in a book that is placed outside of the Ark of the Covenant, so next to the Ark. But what's inside the Ark of the Covenant? The 10 Commandments of God, the moral law, not the handwritten ordinances that was against us. This is why we see the same wording from Paul that says the same law, this handwritten one, is the one that was against us in Colossians 2 verse 14. Now, because we're in the Old Testament, we look at Hebrew. And when we look at the word handwritten, it's the word miktav, handwriting, a written document, a written record. In this case, what is it referring to? The ceremonial laws and civil laws that were handwritten and placed, I'm going to emphasize it again, outside of the ark. Now let's ask the simple question. Can the moral law be nailed to the cross? To answer this, let's bear something in mind, that the moral law existed before sin. Let's look at two examples. If we go back to Genesis 4, what story do we come across? We come across the story of Cain and Abel. And was this the story of one brother murdering the other? Yes, it was. At this point already, we've got Cain murdering Abel, breaking which commandment? Commandment number 6. What about Genesis 39 verse 9? Because here we're talking about Joseph. And Joseph is in the house of Potiphar. Potiphar's wife is trying to grab hold of him, and he refuses to commit this adultery. And he says, how can I do this great sin against God? What is sin? The transgression of the law. To him at that time, breaking that sort of commandment was already sin. Cain was punished for killing Abel, and that was sin. Now, how would we know sin if not for the law? Isn't that what Paul says? Look at what Romans 5 verse 13 and 14 says. It tells us that death reigned from Adam to Moses because the law was already in place. This is why Romans 4 verse 15 says, where there's no law, there's no transgression. For sin is the transgression of the law. Think about this. Even Satan in heaven sins. Now, how can he sin if there's no law? The law must have already been there. The point I'm trying to make is this. The cross pays for the penalty of breaking God's law. It does not remove the law itself. It simply pays for that penalty that you and I should have paid for. And this is why the cross changes everything. We know from Matthew 27 verse 51 that when Jesus dies in the temple, that veil between the holy and the most holy place is torn in two. What did this indicate? It indicated that the sacrificial system was done with. It was over. The handwriting of ordinances was gone. But the 10 Commandments, God's moral law written with his own finger in stone, still stands according to Psalms 111. So what was nailed to the cross was simply the IOU of the sacrificial system, not the Ten Commandment moral law of God.